Hi there and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about tipping culture in Portugal because according to a recent article, it's on the up. So according to this article in the Portugal News, tipping seems to be increasing in Portugal. And in the period between 2015 and 2023, it basically doubled. From 59.6 million euros in 2015 to 121.6 million in 2023. This is using data from the tax office in Portugal. And they also note that between 2022 and 2023, there was a 16% increase in the amount of tips or gratuities received by service staff. And this would include in restaurants and hotels and maybe even taxis and things like that. However, the article also admits that in Portugal, most people who receive tips do not declare the income, even though it's only subject to a 10% tax rate, which is much more favourable than other income tax rates in Portugal. You know, the progressive brackets are all higher than 10%. But even with that said, the tax office recognised that a lot of it just goes unreported. So what we're dealing with here are figures for reported income for people who have actually declared their tips to the tax authorities, as they should do, obviously. You know, it would be very bad to keep this kind of thing secret. We couldn't possibly approve of that. I think when reading these numbers, we have to bear a few things in mind. I mean, just saying, okay, well, tips have doubled since 2015, or, they're up by 16% since last year. Yeah, a couple of caveats here. First of all, inflation obviously is being quite high for some of that period, including last year. I think that probably accounts for a chunk of the 16% increase anyway, just inflationary pressures. Secondly, you have the rise of electronic payments. More and more people are paying via app or they're paying via credit card or something like that. And you have to use the machines to make the payments. So there's a record of these kind of things. You add the tip in the app or you add the tip when you're paying by your credit card. You don't just leave cash on the table in many cases. I think that's probably also driving up the amount that people are reporting because they feel they have to report it as it's been electronically recorded. I also think that, especially in the tourist areas like Lisbon, Porto, Madeira, you're seeing more and more restaurants introduce, compulsory service charges. And I think that if they have service charges, it's the company that's gathering it in and then probably distributing it to the staff as tips or whatever. I don't know exactly how it works, but there definitely has been an increase in the number of businesses, the number of restaurants basically that you see imposing service charges. So that might be a factor which has influenced the data as well. And finally, of course, the impact of foreigners, especially tourists, and I would say probably North Americans have a disproportionate effect on this because tipping culture is particularly strong in North America, particularly in the United States. If we look at the map that's on the screen now, we can see the tipping levels throughout the world as suggested by this organisation. Portugal, it said that a 10% tip is normal. I would heavily dispute that. I don't think that, the UK is also listed as 10%, for example. In fact, almost all Europe is 10%. I don't think that in Portugal the tipping culture is anything like that in the UK. The UK 10%, yeah, I think that is probably ballpark accurate. You should leave a tip that's about that level. Yeah, I can see that. In Portugal, though, it tends to be more along the lines of just leave a little bit, maybe round up the bill. If it was, 20.50 and you gave 30 euros in cash, then you might leave 150 or something. The tips here tend to be much smaller. They're not based on a percentage of the bill as far as I can see. It's much more like a couple of euros, maybe 1 to 3 euros. If you've had truly exceptional service, I think as well is a factor. people in Portugal don't routinely leave tips. I mean, Portuguese people, it's not normal here for them to do it. It's something which has very much been brought to the country, maybe because of the influence of tourism. And I think in the touristy areas, places like the Algarve, Lisbon, Porto, Madeira, etc., you do very much see it, and it is kind of expected, especially if you're a foreigner dining in a restaurant there. The waiting staff basically expect you to leave some kind of tip. Now in the United States, it's common to leave between 18 and 22% of the bill as a tip, which is just huge. I know many Americans who think that this is just awful. And it's expected as well. Whether the service is good, the service is bad, the waiting staff in the US, they just expect to get their tip. I think that is really quite unreasonable, and I don't think that it's reflective of the situation in Portugal. If you've received bad service or not particularly good service in Portugal, I think that most Portuguese people, and certainly myself, wouldn't leave any tip. I would only leave a tip when I thought that the food had been truly, truly excellent and or the service had been fantastic. Probably the latter. I'm not the kind of person that tips very often because I'm a bit of a miser. In Thailand, the expats there who like to penny pinch and don't give tips and things are usually called cheap Charlies, and they actually have a chain of restaurants called that. I think I'd probably fall into that category. I'm not the kind of person who just likes to throw money away on unnecessary things like giving tips. Because in Europe, it's not the same situation as in the US. In the US, many waiting staff are working for like a few dollars an hour, and they're having their salaries made up by the tips. So it's a massive component of their salary. In Europe, that's not the case. Basically, what you have here is people are working maybe for minimum wage, and they get the tips in addition to that. So I think it's a more comfortable position, and I also think that's why many people here don't feel that leaving a tip is obligatory. I certainly don't. So I'd be very interested to know the opinions of people who are watching the video in the comment section below about, what kind of tip do you usually leave when you're in a restaurant in Portugal? Do you leave any tip at all? Or do you just do it in cases where you think that the service or the food are really exceptional, similar to my attitude? Or do you maybe have a US-based attitude where you think that a tip is something which is mandatory and you have certain levels in mind? Certainly, I don't think that it's fantastic if the tipping culture in Portugal kind of mutates to be something like what the US has, because I don't feel comfortable with having a kind of mandatory 20% tipping system. I don't think it's reasonable at all, and to be honest, I think most people would feel the same way. Anyway, let me know what you think. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you found the content interesting, and I will see you soon in the next one.